Hello and welcome to Bubble Baths and Beyond, expanding practices of self-care for TGD folks working in community. My name is Steph, and I am also here with Jack, and we are excited to be here. We will move right along. We'll introduce ourselves in just a second.
We also wanted to introduce our objectives for this session. We are hoping to understand the forms of bias and the pyramid of hate model and their relevance to social advocacy and self-care. We are also, in the best way we can in a recorded session, going to discuss and develop strategies for addressing the multiple forms and layers of self-care. We're going to expand the definition and our understandings of self-care, so we can look forward to that. We're also going to address burnout and develop some understandings of the resilience in the understandings of resilience in the context of advocacy.
Yeah. So, like I said, my name is Steph deNormand. I use they them pronouns. I am the manager of the Trans Health program at Fenway Health, but I am also an advocate and activist and have worked in the trans and gender diverse communities for my entire professional career, and some of it not also. I am particularly interested in and engaged in queer and trans theories, disability studies, and kind of broadly issues of public health. And I am always very excited to be talking with and specifically to trans and gender diverse folks about how we can, best take care of ourselves and best be ourselves. So it's a little bit about me.
And hello, everyone. My name is Jack Bruno. I am a white and Indigenous, specifically a Sisseton Band Potawatomi tribal member. I am a trans-masculine queer person. I am the operations coordinator for the Division of Education and Training at the National LGBTQIA+ Health Education Center at the Fenway Institute in Fenway Health. I'm also just wrapped up my first year as an MSW candidate at Simmons here in Boston, and I have a BA in American Studies from Tufts University, wherein I spent a lot of time working on queer studies, Indigenous studies, cultural studies, media studies, whatever I could get my hands on, really, to try to understand the ways in which I'm walking through the world and how our structures and identities really impact our lived experiences. And now in my work as a social worker, how to help make those lived experiences a little bit more possible, a little bit more humane in the world that we share. Like Steph said, I also really appreciate any opportunity to speak within community and to be here in asynchronistic dialogue with you all. So thanks again for having us. And to get a little bit of a view of where we're headed today, we wanted to provide a little bit of a roadmap. So we're going to begin a discussion with Steph around multiple forms of bias, as well as kind of talking about intersectionality in this context. Also introducing the pyramid model of oppression and why understanding kind of the day-to-day microaggressions and validations are so crucial to addressing larger invalidations or violences in the world that we might advocate around. And then we're really going to dive into making more complex the idea of self-care and breaking that out into different conceptualization.
We wanted to start off with talking kind of broadly about how we are thinking about bias. I think a lot of the things, kind of the initial like topics that we're talking about are not necessarily going to be new to almost anyone that we're speaking to here. But we kind of wanted to center where we were thinking about and kind of how we were structuring a lot of what we're thinking through. So when we're talking about bias, we're thinking about prejudice in favor for or against a particular thing, person, or group when compared with another, usually in a way that's considered to be unfair. So we're thinking about there being many different kind of forms and levels of those biases and kind of going into those each a little bit more in detail. The first off kind of like biggest or smallest picture, excuse me, is looking at that individual or internalized. I think my next slide is a little bit more as to kind of those individual interactions. So one-on-one or kind of those like individual singular interactions, or someone's relationship to themselves. So kind of that experience of internalized transphobia, shame, anxiety that folks are experiencing as a result of the way that others interact with them. So that's kind of what we're thinking about with that individual or internalized, kind of how I experience existing in the world. Interpersonal is the way that others are interacting with me. So an example of that, kind of the most obvious example of that is going to be harassment, discrimination, kind of those one person acting on another person is the way that I usually think about interpersonal, or kind of small groups of people. It doesn't have to be a singular person, but other people interacting with the person. Then we have institutional, which we're thinking about kind of institutional level cultural practices that are perpetuating inequity. So I usually think about that as like individual policies, practices, or like individual organizations that have particular ideas, concept, policies, or it says cultural practices also. I like to think of that cultural practices as being very broadly defined also. So like the culture of a workplace, the culture of a community, the way that people generally interact with each other, that again perpetuate those inequities, kind of in both small microaggression type ways and also kind of really big ways. And then kind of the largest scope that I usually think about is structural, which is going to be those joint operations of institutions producing inequitable outcomes. So I usually think about social determinants or social factors of health, where there are multiple different policies, practices, sometimes laws, cultural interactions that are all coming together to create inequitable outcomes, to create kind of different experiences of the world depending on who you are and how you are existing within those spaces. So that's kind of the structure that we're thinking through with bias here. And then shifting into the concept of intersectionality, wanted to, first off, highlight this incredible quote from Audre Lorde. There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives, which I think really kind of reflects the way that we are approaching intersectionality. So to go into a little bit more of an overview of what we're thinking about when we're talking about intersectionality. Intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks, it intersects. So where privileges are granted or withheld along identity categories, we can also and really should look at how these intersections are playing out for individuals, teams, and communities. So we're thinking about both individual identities and kind of how they interact with each other for individual experiences, as well as not just those individual identities, but also these systems of oppression and privilege that are then contributing to the way that many people are existing within our spaces, and many people of many different or similar identities are then interacting with each other. So it really is kind of this whole, which I think is part of the our inspiration in using these watercolors, is the way that all of these things mix and interact and change the way that they are perceived and also interacting with each other. So complicated and lots of different things going on at once, but is exciting to kind of talk about some of these individual intersections and the way that they reflect many other things.
And we did want to think about some of the foundational aspects of intersectionality and to kind of reinscribe the institutional or the structural importance of and context of when we're talking about intersectionality, because intersectionality as an idea has been extrapolated a little bit, in my opinion, to really be again kind of like re-individualized. And so we can talk about people, it's a little bit of an oxymoron, people having intersecting identities, because we all have intersecting identities. We all have a race, we all have a gender, we all have a sexual orientation, we all have a class identity, etc. And so those things kind of stay abstracted or like wiggly unless we inscribed this idea of institutionalized structural discrimination or structural inaccess to resources and opportunities. And so we wanted to really go back to kind of some of the foundational thinkers, Crenshaw, of course, being one of them, and uh, really teasing out the ideas of intersectionality in a legal context and looking at three court cases that really demonstrated the concept of intersectionality, wherein Black women were found to have no legal grounds for seeking justice for workplace discrimination and labor practices levied against them as specifically Black women. The companies could claim that they didn't discriminate against Black men and they didn't discriminate against white women. So Black women who said that they were being systematically discriminated against as people existing in the intersection of people who are Black and people who are women were legislated out of protection. And so thinking about how that intersecting identity was rendered legally unable to access protections under discrimination laws. So really wanted to reinscribe that that foundational thought and carry that forward in our conversation around intersectionality. And we also saw that this exclusion rather, was happening in advocate spaces. So if we're thinking about anti-racism and civil rights movements, we're primarily addressing oppression based on race, regardless of the impact and the efforts and the labor of Black women. And we're seeing that, those are holding up patriarchal norms and centering the needs of Black men in particular. And these are all kind of criticisms that are coming out of Black feminism in particular. And criticisms also levied against white feminism, wherein folks were addressing primarily oppression based on gender while upholding racist norms and centering the needs of white women in particular. So we can think about that in regards to labor or reproductive justice, the labor issues or the reproductive justice issues that predominantly middle class white women who were engaged in white feminism were contending with weren't the issues that were most salient or most pressing or felt the most important for Black women and other women of color. So we're seeing this legal exclusion as well as this exclusion in advocacy spaces. So just kind of naming again the structural way in which intersectionality is playing out in these different contexts, and in doing so, underlying the importance of understanding the context when we're thinking about how intersecting identities play out uh, within structures, within groups, within communities. And so again, we wanted to lift up the thinkers, the writers, the foundational folks engaged in the work of Black feminism. And this Angela Davis quote that I love that says that when Black women win victories, it's a boost for virtually every segment of society. So talking again about the ways in which in this particular piece, Black women, were existing in that excluded space, that legislated space of invisibility and unprotectedness. So Black women making ground, having victories in a legal space or in an employment protection space and a reproductive justice space, were making having victories for society writ large, being folks that were at some of the most vulnerable positions in society. So thinking about those who are most disenfranchised, those that are most vulnerable because of intersecting systems of oppression, and what does it mean then to have victories for those folks with those folks from those folks. And when we talk about self-care, we'll get to how we keep ourselves engaged in that work as people who may have multiple intersecting identities that are marginalized and targeted. So thinking about Sojourner Truth, thinking about Ida B. Wells, and then the more recent waves of thinkers who have really embodied and created the canon of Black feminist thought. Patricia Hill Collins and Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde, Angela Davis and Alice Walker, Toni Morrison. Without these thinkers, we wouldn't be equipped with the thoughts and the conceptualizations to really have this conversation in such a fleshed out way. And so to talk more about introducing different models of viewing intersecting lenses, we can think more, well, now that we're equipped with this understanding of the fact that we all have multiple identities that may be privileged or may be marginalized. We can think about the ways in which those interact with each other as well. Because we can consider how our race informs our gender, or how our class shapes our ideas about ability. For instance, growing up as a white coded biracial person, that experience framed my understanding of my class identity, and my gender identity shapes how I think about myself as a person with a college education. So our matrix of identities aren't static, but they're cross-informing. They are matrices that are informing each other in very complex functions based on the interactions of our social identities. So we're much more than a list of our identities. We're actually a really complex internal, like, ecological system of our identities, which I think is beautiful and compelling. And a way that we can kind of think about this, and of course Crenshaw has the idea of being caught at the intersection, of standing in a street and being caught in intersecting forces. And so I am really compelled by visual metaphors. And so another visual metaphor for thinking about how we can understand identities through the lens of yet another identity that we hold is the idea of this 20-sided die, or any other kind of complex shape. We can think about each face having an identity category on it, one of our social locations. So there's an illustration here that I've kind of sketched up to try to recreate that. But we can look through the lens of age and look through this transparent shape and see class, for instance. So how do we understand being working class, for instance, as a young person? And how does that change over the lifespan? So as we're thinking about our conversation around bias, around intersectionality, and around expanding the ideas of self-care, how are these intersecting complex self and cross-creating identities informing how we go about engaging in self-care, the kinds of access that we have to different forms of self-care, and what kinds of care that we need as people facing different kinds of struggles, different kinds of disenfranchisement, or different kinds of pressures. If we're thinking about the minority stress model, for instance, what kind of stressors are we carrying, and how can we understand and see them through the lens of intersectionality, or this lens of seeing our different identities through the lens of others? So thank you for diving in a little bit into a somewhat abstract conversation around intersectionality. And then as we're talking a little bit more about the environment that we're all living in, because we're carrying these incredible complex ecologies of identity, or these constellations of identities with us. We're not doing that in a vacuum. We're existing out in the world and encountering in whatever ways we do, or perpetuating and encountering in whatever combination of identities that we have. These challenging situations. We are at a trans professionals conference, and for those of us that have a TGD, etc. identity, transphobia is atmospheric. It's in the groundwater, unfortunately, being part of a transphobic society. And we can add on all the other axes of oppression and discrimination onto that. We, live in a structurally racist society. We live in a structurally classist and ageist society. And So this model, the pyramid model, is something that has existed for a while to explain and really conceptualize the ways in which the somewhat small or seemingly trivial components of the isms build up and contribute to environments in which larger violences are possible. And so we can see at the foundation of the pyramid attitudes and beliefs. Those are kind of the overarching cultural kind of not motifs, but cultural discourses around that include isms, right? So again, we're seeing transphobia, sexism, disableism. We might just say ableism there, ageism, homophobia, etc. Kind of create this foundation. That's the well that folks are kind of going to, or that structures are just built on. They don't need to have someone actively, we don't have to have someone actively at a bank being actively racist for redlining to happen. The policies just are written into place, and policies around redlining, around what lending looks like, around what neighborhoods are and aren't available for lending. And those can perpetuate themselves without, they can write the racism out of a racist policy. And so we can see communities of color being drained of resources or being underlended to without there having to be necessarily an explicit racist agenda there. So you can kind of take that person out of the bank and the bank can still perpetuate that without a problem. But that attitude and beliefs build a foundation for cultural microaggressions, and we can add micro invalidations there as well. These are all the little kind of comments or uh, ways of being. So body language, crossing the street. If you see someone on the same side of the street as you that maybe you think might be a threat just based on their perception, your perception of them. So these are the small verbal and nonverbal snubs or questions or invalidations that can build up over time and create really significant harm. And on top of that, we have the verbal expression, and those are actually the intentional jokes and harassments and snubs and questions that create a kind of hostile environment. And we get up to physical expressions of harm. And then at the top of this model, it says homicide and suicide. And we can even extrapolate from that. We can add on to that something on a much larger scale. This can build actually up to acts of genocide. And so, and those acts of genocide can be as direct as mass targeting for death and harm, or it can be the kind of more structural institutionalized genocide of residential schools. It can be the cultural genocide of punishing people for speaking their native languages. It can be kind of that cultural genocide and assimilationist pressures that seeks not only to destroy the body but to also destroy communities and cultures.
And I think that we unfortunately have had, particularly within the past 5 years, a growing public awareness and frankly, a very clear case study in the way that these things step up and can step up pretty quickly when we start to normalize or like have more space for attitudes and beliefs that then makes more space for cultural microaggressions, that makes more space for those verbal expressions that result in building up of violence, both physical and otherwise. I think that we've had like such a clear case study of that in the US over the past 5 years, and also in some other areas as well, that has in some ways brought greater awareness to some folks who were not looking at the problems that were very clear to folks facing them, but also has kind of bolstered a lot of those attitudes and beliefs that then create that space, create that allowance on a kind of social cultural level for stepping up those steps of the pyramid, and kind of making it more okay, so to speak, to make those steps up, because we've normalized the step below it. So unfortunately, I think there will be many papers written and many theses written over about the past 5 years and kind of showing kind of representative models of these things.
I agree wholeheartedly. And the underlying similarity, right, between the attitudes and beliefs that are mentioned here is the process of dehumanization and othering. And those are also self-creating and self-perpetuating and cross-perpetuating. And so we're again talking about that intersectionality piece of racist sexism and sexist homophobia, for instance, the way in which these things really do bolster each other. And so to chip away on one piece without chipping away on the other pieces is only a partial intervention. And so really the foundational piece for all of these subsequent violences, or in creating an environment in which these violences are tolerable, maybe not even acceptable, but tolerable, are those acts of dehumanization. So thank you,
It's not
Steph.
a coincidence that we are seeing increases in violence against BIPOC communities while we are seeing increased legislation around trans bodies, while we are seeing, kind of could expand much further than that, but like, it's not a coincidence that these things all happen in tandem, because it's that dehumanization. It's that making it easier to not think about people as people so we can step up that chain.
Right. And in addition, legislation around limiting access to elements of reproductive justice. I think that it's an entire web. Yeah. So
yeah, so that's a lot. And I think that what our conception, what our initial thought in creating this particular talk is to talk about what does self-care look like, and like acknowledging the very real burnout of being particularly a transgender diverse person who is working with or often against kind of all at once these systems. We'll talk about that. And still, working to build resistance within our communities and doing the work that is so important that many, if not all of us are doing. We have a habit, I have found, and I know is true for myself, of then forgetting to care for ourselves, which is only exacerbating that burnout and making everything more complicated, everything more difficult. So this concept of self-care is even that much more important. And then also thinking about the ways that our bodies, our experiences, and our communities are often not then represented in what we think about in self-care. So we, again, coming back to some of our bigger foundational theorists, Audre Lorde quoted saying, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And I think that, kind of pivoting on to moving and talking about that concept of self-care is where we're going to take the rest of this conversation. So, oh yeah, that's the quote that I just said. So really thinking more about what does self-care look like? And I think that, while we're talking about kind of cultural, societal expectations, what are we then told self-care should be? What are like the messages that we get? This was just a like representative scroll through of stock images for self-care. You are welcome to do it yourself. It is, you'll see a lot of this. And I think to kind of point to some of the things that stick out to me the most are, first off, it's very industry, right? It's very capitalist. It's very, there are 1,000,001 self-help books. There are 1,000,001 self-care products, or not self-care help, sorry, self-care products, self-care books, how to do it right, so to speak. And I think a lot of it is, here's the best face mask to buy. Here is, here is the best yoga class to take. These like pastels, it's the right products, here's the right way to do it. And it is all very individual, either self-soothing, or like, here's the retail therapy that you can engage in, essentially, in order to to feel better. And those things, I think, necessarily, one, are assuming that you have the means to do so, which when we are looking at, the broad scope of folks that we're talking to, looking at issues of class and race and gender and ability and all of these things, who has the, to take yoga class as an example, I think that that's like a very very like specific and clear image that a lot of people are branded with self-care. We're thinking about who has the time, the money, the ability, the safe space to engage, all of these things that are assumed in saying like, oh, just do yoga and it'll help you relax. And even down to like, here's the right, I don't know, bath salts to buy. Here's a nice bath bomb. It's all of this like commodified and like all very focused on self-soothing. I think it's also worth thinking about like pointing to acknowledging this like minimalist pastels aesthetic that goes along with self-care also, that is very gendered. And I think also then plays into the way that that particularly folks who are non-binary and masculine presenting or understanding of themselves then have difficulty finding where they fit. And then folks who are in kind of those feminine spectrums having those very clear lines of like, this counts. This is what you are expected to buy. This is what you're expected to engage in. Do you have other kind of things that pop out to you when we're looking at this, Jack?
The word that really sticks out to me is aspirational. So what does it mean to have aspirational self-care instead of, self-care that is really like where you are and with the body that you have and in a place that you're currently occupying. And so I'm looking right now at the self-care routine, and it just is so like, it's so just popping out to me as something that like we have to constantly be working towards. So what does it mean to just have like another like self-improvement piece? So self-care as like self-improvement, like another kind of individualistic idea of like improving myself and therefore like re-engaging in productivity. So like rest and recuperating so that I can like go back and like jump back into the hustle. And it seems a little bit to me like it's really dovetailed with the wellness industry, and really about like purchasing these products in order to like pamper yourself in a very specific way, and to have a very specific kind of like self-reflection routine with yourself, and then to just lost my train of thought, but it was there for a second. Aspirational is one thing that I wanted to point out. Consumeristic is another thing that I wanted to point out. And then the third thing was it's like this cross section, the people that we do have in this section, and this has been the case too for other kind of like Google searches and just kind of image scans, is that it's very white. There's not a lot of, very thin, very white. There's like, it's a very hegemonic cultural space. And so to name that as well.
I think it's one of the things that you kind of like said but didn't focus on was the individualism of it, which is particularly that like very like white Western ideal of individualism. I think that in one of our conversations in planning this, we had talked about it kind of being like a very like oddly pull yourself up by your bootstraps perspective on caring for yourself, which is fascinating to then think about, and the ways that we think about the like, what does it mean to take care of yourself? It means taking care of only yourself. Then it means by having a minute to yourself. It means having peace to yourself. And if that is always the only way to produce or to practice self-care, to engage in self-care. And then the other thing that you mentioned that I know that we'll talk about more in a minute is the reason for self-care. And I think that some of the searches that we did showed this, although I don't know that this particular screen shows it as much, that the reason for self-care is so that you can get back into the workforce, so that you can return to the thing that you need to care for yourself, to recover from, as opposed to like taking care of yourself is probably the thing that should be top priority for pretty much everybody, and taking care of, practicing self-care on in a broad definition level is like a purpose for being in and of itself, a purpose for engaging in and of itself. It does not have to be so that you can go back to work on Monday. And I think that that's another thing you mentioned. Go ahead.
Yeah, tied to productivity in the workplace or parenthood.
Yes.
It's
right. Get a break from my kids type deal. Mm-hmm. Which is also very gendered, very coded. We don't say that about, cis men who are parents going out and doing things. We don't typically think about it in that way. We think about, woman, feminine presenting, needing that break, also thinking about labor divisions, thinking about the ways that we engage in things in the workplace. Again, all of these things start to kind of weave into one expression and understanding of what we are assuming to mean both self-care, but also like who needs care, who is engaging in work, whose work counts. Like it starts to all expand and explode out from there.
Yeah, it's buy these products so that you can work better, or so that you can produce better, or like engage in reproductive labor better. Yeah, in an aspirational way. Okay, so let's let's dive in. Let's get a little expansive and creative with this. Yeah. So from that conversation, it seems like there's a lot to be desired from how kind of mainstream self-care, honestly, marketing and imagining is happening. So to frame this this next part of the conversation, we can think and reflect and encourage other folks to think about what do we need as individuals, teams, and communities when we're engaged in this work, since we know that change doesn't happen overnight. Policy change, legislative change, advocacy work, sometimes we're in it for the long haul. And so how do we keep ourselves and each other and our teams cared for in the meantime? And so thinking about when burnout does happen, how does that affect our work? And I would expand that to say ourselves, and our communities. And where are there opportunities to address burnout and make our work more sustainable? So just the small questions to really get us thinking as we move forward into this. And I think that it's important to name that I don't think that we have solutions. I think that we have a lot more questions than we do have solutions. But I think that that's also kind of the joy and the beauty of this, and that we get to engage in conversations with people who are actually like in the advocacy work in the professional fields, and are grappling with this as well. So we encourage folks. I know that there will be a share out, a self-care strategies share out meetup that is scheduled, and we'd love to hear about how you're grappling with these things, these questions about burnout and sustainability in your work, in your advocacy, in your life, honestly. And so a model that I found to be really interesting is the Diana Zant's model of self-care. And that expands what we might consider to be self-care into a couple of different, what I've conceptualized here as concentric circles. And so we can map these a little bit onto our ideas about bias or discrimination and oppression happening on the internal, external, community, and structural level. So if we can kind of think of them as somewhat parallels, that might be kind of a helpful thing. But a lot of what has been considered self-care, a lot of the stuff that we looked at, for instance, in that Google search, actually can be considered self-soothing. So those are activities that provide distraction and or comfort in difficult times. We can think of those as those coping mechanisms. That's that bubble bath. That's that like really great favorite snack that that you're enjoying in order to get through that stressful thing. For me, it might be ridiculous YouTube videos, but that helps in the moment and helps you kind of get through that stressful thing, or it's just that soothing until something can shift, a change can be made. Self-care actually in this model are activities that help you find meaning and support your growth and groundedness. So self-care might be, making it to that doctor's appointment, or going to your judo class, or engaging in a hobby that you enjoy. It's those things that really ground you and give you meaning in life, whatever that means for you. So again, highly individualistic. Um, and I would say maybe less marketable. Hmm. um, Community care is kind of where we're getting a little bit more outside of the self, and kind of a newer understanding of what self-care is. And so community care are those workarounds for systems that don't inherently support care. And so, for instance, in Somerville, where I live, there are a number of pop-up community pantries that are happening around the community, and people are dropping off a, a sizable amount of food there for free for folks to come and engage with. There's a dry pantry, and there are freezer and fridge set up in a lot of different locations. And so we might consider this community care. It's stuff that people are doing outside of themselves, outside of their immediate circle, but as kind of a patchwork care for structures that are failing. So if we're thinking about food distribution, food access being kind of the structural piece that isn't providing the kind of care that it could and should be, community care is how we get by in place of that structural care that's foolproof. So if you think about childcare pods that were happening at the height of the COVID epidemic lockdown, where people were within a pod exchanging childcare responsibilities throughout the week. That might be considered community care as well. So these are more upstream ways of caring for the community and for the self. And so structural cares then are that larger system. Those are systems that support community care, self-care, and self-soothing. So something like a policy like uh, healthcare for all or universal basic income could be considered structural care as kind of an ultimate upstream support that then reduces the need for those patches that we see on the community care workarounds that um, mitigate some of the stresses that self-care activities have to address. Maybe you can do those things for pleasure and for self gratifying your own interests and your own curiosities, but less about just getting through the day or getting through a hard time, and then then having to do less self-soothing. So kind of expanding this model and then thinking about how are we engaging in these different levels, how are we advocating for different structural care and community care pieces that then are impacting our lives, the lives of people that we care about on the self-care and self-soothing levels. And so we wanted to kind of open up a curious space here to think about some of the themes that we've engaged in throughout the presentation so far, and just kind of sit with them and think through them for a second together.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I was thinking about as you were going through the that self-care model again was the ways that even some of the same activities are you can engage in them in different levels and can mean different things doing the same thing. So I was thinking about that, the yoga class that is super white and pink and whatever that we're branding, that if someone is engaging in a like physical either exercise or like relaxation technique, that may be self-soothing at times, but it can also just be something that you enjoy and have the space to engage in when those like all of the other things are settled into place. Yeah. When you have the ability to do that because you want to, not because it's the only way that you can then return to work, return to childcare, return to other responsibilities. I think that tone is kind of the thing that I'm thinking about, is what does it mean to be able to engage in whatever it is you want to do to seek joy and fulfillment and not recovery. So that's like something that I'm currently kind of playing with.
Yeah, and what would it mean to have less to recover from structurally? Because we're all going to experience stressors as human people, but you know, some of us have more structural stress to recover from than others, and so we're tossing in resiliency to like have that conversation at another time. But like, what would it mean to have less that we have to be resilient around? And to your yoga example, we could expand that to community care as well. If you are a yoga teacher, if you have a Saturday morning class that you hold specifically for TGD women in your community, and that now becomes community care a little bit. And then, if you like advocate for with your yoga studio for, um, around the like restrooms and the facilities, now you're engaged in structural care. And so, the context, the intention, the energy, the how expansive you're engaged with, like those can all, I think, move you up and down that spectrum of care, for sure.
And I think is also interesting to think about, which is like not necessarily the topic here, but just made me think of the ways that conversations around allyship also are interesting there, in what does it look like, or frankly not look like at times, to be practicing as an ally, and what are the ways that folks who are allied to various communities and various structures can do some of that work to make it so that other folks who hold identities don't have to engage in that work or be the only ones engaging in that work. But the ways that the kind of ally communities also play into the ability and the flexibility with which individuals and impacted communities or marginalized communities can then engage in ways that they are choosing to, as opposed to like required to, in order to exist in a space, or in order to exist safely or more safely in a space.
Yeah, I think I get a sense of something that you're naming there is the like unrecognized labor that it takes to engage in spaces that aren't I feel like what you're naming there, Steph, is the like unpaid labor that it takes to exist in a space that is not built for you or antagonistic towards your like holistic participation in that space, and asking allies or allies being able to take the like incentive and sometimes to take on some of that labor by first explicitly naming that it exists, because I think that a lot of times it does go unspoken, and having allies take that on, I think that's really important, to then free up some of that just capacity to do other work, or even to engage in self-care, or to be able to do what's in our job description.
Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things that I've noticed, particularly um, in professional spaces with trans folks, and like working with trans communities, not necessarily like amongst trans folks, although they are also, that there is always a very hard push towards, we need to hire a trans person to do this. We need to have a trans person here. And I think that that's something that I like want to play with a little bit too, of like the pros and cons of that. I am in mostly healthcare settings, so like that's where most of my experience in hearing this is. And I feel like that, like, I feel like it's very much a yes and for me. Like, yes, we need to have more trans folks in spaces where we are learning to better understand what trans folks need, and who are, one, just hiring trans folks in general because trans people should be able to be employed, but two, like having unique expertise in working with like communities has pros, and like we could, I'm sure, both go on for quite a while about the pros of that. But I think that there is a habit or an instinct to either do the, like, we hire the one trans person who's going to fix everything or whose job is to do all of the trans stuff, that doesn't necessarily always beforehand think through what is the experience of often the only trans person we are hiring, being the one who is then also doing, like, having all of the work for and about trans and gender diverse people and identities kind of all put into one bucket, into one person. And the way that that then kind of creates this, in some ways, a like institutionally supported tokenization, where it is your job to do all of the things for and about trans folks or with trans folks, depending on the role. I think there are a number of different models of this. And also, you are uniquely impacted as compared to other people, other cis folks that are on the team in that program. I see this a lot, particularly with like surgery centers, where they hire like a single trans person as their navigator, or like the only people who they are hiring who are trans are their navigators, and those are the only trans or gender diverse identified staff, or who are expected to be out. I see a lot also expected to disclose trans and gender diverse identities, and that there is clear benefit in engaging with community and having safe folks to talk to and having like identities to relate to, but also what are the stressors that we are then putting on people in those positions, particularly when they often are also having to advocate for themselves within their workplace as trans folks, in addition to advocating for their patients who are trans folks. So that kind of touches on a couple of the points that we have here, but I think leads into this bigger conversation of what does it look like for us to actually create and support structures for people to work within communities that they also exist in. And this is not unique to trans folks either. Like, I want to make clear that I'm not saying it is. But I have noticed that being a particular trend that I think is net not great for trans folks and their ability to then care for themselves, because there is then also that sense of, not only is it my job to do this, but if I'm not going to do it, no one else is. So I have to be the advocator. I have to be advocating for myself, for my clients and patients. I also have to make all of the structural change. I am also held accountable by my own community for working within an institution that may or may not be the most affirming, or may or may not be the best, or meeting everyone's needs. Like, it becomes this really like multiplicative role, that can get folks trapped. And I know that I've talked to a number of people in those places, and I've seen or worked with programs who are trying to build spaces where they like want to have trans folks front and center, but I think sometimes that also then means like our token that we can put out in front. Like, I think that all of these things then play into how do we, as individuals who are in those places, care for ourselves, but also how do we create community supports and community structures, which I think TPATH is a good example of that, of being able to then support trans professionals who are working in this field also. So I think it kind of all mushes into one there, but it's something that I'm also thinking a lot about.
Yeah, and I think that you bring up so many really solid points, and I want to add the in terms of the dual roles aspect. Thinking about, I'm in school to get my social work license, and I hope to be a clinician. Like, I hope to and really focus my work on supporting TGD folks, supporting my community, and I also am holding that because of the requirements of therapeutic relationships and confidentiality and things like that, I very well may lose access to some of my community spaces and community supports and things like that. And so how do we kind of walk that line? I know that there are ways that clinicians hold space for themselves and for their clients and are able to navigate that. But depending on, where and who you are, your community may be fairly small. And so our opportunities for community care and self-care engagements within a community context may shrink once we get a licensure or once we really delve into clinical work, or if we expand our practice, for instance. So thinking about trying to be strategic and taking the initiative around how am I going to handle that once I'm out in the world, and I may be, what is my panel going to look like, and how is that going to change the geography of what I'm able to access as a person who also needs these community spaces. So that's kind of what dual roles brought up for me as well.
Yeah, and I mean, the two of us are privileged to be in the Northeast in the US, to be in New England in a space where there are multiple spaces for us to individually engage in, and usually can find places to get that community support that isn't engaging with our patients, our clients, and like folks that we are working with. But also that is very much not true in a lot of other places. And what does it mean to then lose access to spaces that you individually were finding supportive, or like is the only space that's available to you, and now you don't have access to it anymore, while also then supporting. I think one of the other things, particularly in kind of the clinical roles, that I am not a clinician myself, but work a lot with our clinicians, who are then also, often personally engaging with, dealing with, thinking about a lot of similar things that their clients are engaging with, dealing with, thinking about. So whether that is, kind of internal stuff, or whether it is interpersonal discrimination or harassment, whether it's both of you disagreeing with the way that the institution that you work at are handling something. Like there are all of these unique ways that then muddy that, make it much more difficult both to maintain that therapeutic relationship at times, like really create a need to create some very strong and intentional boundaries in how you are engaging, and also make it much more complicated to be the person in that place, where you are having to kind of hold all of your own stuff, and maybe having that much less access to having someone to unpack it with you, you know, makes it that much more difficult to be a person and professional in the field. Not to discourage you.
Thanks. I think I'm I think I'm a little too far in at this point. But speaking of graduate school, thinking about uncoupling productivity from work, this is something that I really grapple with and is really challenging for me. So thinking about how we destigmatize rest in again, a very like capitalistic Western worldview, a paradigm that really equates in like very ageist, ableist, right, classist ways, our worth with our productivity, or our worth with our ability to like contribute in very specific ways. You know, question mark, where do we go with that?
Yeah, we are so steeped in that capitalism of like, and I think that like the slide of the like, what does branded self-care look like, is very much like you need to buy these things so that you can work, so that you can earn money, so that you can buy more things, so that you can handle working, so that you can like, it's that perpetuation of that cycle. And not, what does it look like for us to, one, be able to, I think I said earlier, like engage in practices that are self-care broadly defined because they are personally fulfilling and enjoyable, or some variety of those kind of words or that theme, as opposed to that like I am I am resting so that I can produce further.
And
Um,
earned it too,
yeah,
that you've earned your like vacation days, or you've earned your, Sunday spa day or what have you. And I think that that's the like earning and the worthiness of rest, the worthiness of the person, the deservedness. And I think that like worth and deservingness are so coded and so moralized, that it we have to talk about self-care in this kind of political context, because those kind of root foundational ideas of self-care have not been distributed equitably throughout time. If we're thinking about like what does self-care look across racial lines, what does self-care look around sexual orientation, gender identity lines, if we've always been deemed unworthy, or have always been deemed not deserving of care or not deserving of rest, or being on the flip side, right, being like overly indulgent with our care, overly indulgent with rest, and so not deserving of more intentional rest. um you know
and I think that that plays into both the I'm thinking about like the I've certainly heard within my own community this idea more than once of like I can't take, I don't know, I can't take a mental health day or a vacation week or whatever because no one else is going to do my job. I don't know if my clients will be safe, have someone to talk to, be able to, you know, get from where I through that week where I'm taking space away to care for myself. Which then brings back into that like that tokenization within roles, that the uh the often necessitated lack of trust in systems because the system is not sufficiently supporting, um, which also then makes me think about the amount of like unmeasured both expertise and labor that a lot of these roles hold. um, just kind of broadly that a lot of folks who are working with and alongside community hold. A lot of that is not you know, quote unquote billable time. It's the all of the other ways that you're engaging with someone and working with someone and supporting, um, that we can't always depend on a system to hold up when we are stepping away. Um, and what does that mean then for the person themselves to feel like they can take time, but also then the sense of like guilt that a lot of people then have when taking rest. um Not only the did I earn this rest, did I work enough to earn this, am I stressed enough to earn this, am I have I been harmed enough to earn this rest, this space, this care, but also what are the consequences of me caring for myself? Is someone else going to face harm, going to face something because I am not there? um I think all of that then kind of mushes and smashes into people not doing it, like not taking care of themselves. And I know that I am certainly guilty of that, of like wanting and needing to make sure that everything's in place, um, and that sometimes meaning that I don't take the time that I need to. Um, and I also don't think that that is terribly uncommon either.
Yeah, I think for those of us, I'm thinking a little bit of Dean Spade's work around the nonprofit industrial complex. I think there's a treatise in there too about the ways in which structurally it's we're not really set up to take that time.
Right. We have these like bare bone systems of making sure that we can, sometimes it feels like just kind of sustain, like we are good as long as everything is settled, we can manage. Um, and not creating space for people to care for themselves, creating space for people to engage in things that are most important to them and often to communities, um, because we are trying to meet the needs of funders, meet the needs of federal, state level organizations and programs and departments and trying to like cobble and keep things together in a way that just doesn't always meet the needs that we need to.
Right. Okay, well, shall we?
Yeah.
Let's think about how we take this and move forward, or we think about kind of what we might be capable of, what we might have capacity for, or just questions that we want to carry on with us. And so, can we think about policy advocacy as structural care? Can we kind of reinscribe policy advocacy within those concentric circles of care as a paradigm? And again, community organizing. Can we think about that within a paradigm of community care and really uplift, honor, and then work to then make make somewhat obsolete because of upstream support of these community stopgap measures. While holding space for the community programs, community work that actually are really organic and important to maintain. And then, thinking about self-soothing and self-care along the way. How do we more routinely incorporate these into our lives in ways that both recognize some of them are temporally bounded, some of them are just the stopgap things to really like self-soothe, really working with our coping mechanisms, and the self-care aspects being really about what maintains us, what's about making sure that we are well enough in whatever way that means to us to be able to engage with what is fulfilling to us tomorrow. So decoupling that necessarily from productivity, but thinking about wellness in a holistic way, not the wellness industrial complex, but wellness in our kind of holistic ecological selves. And what does that mean for taking care of each other while navigating these spaces as well, navigating structures and the world at large? Steph, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that when the one thing that I wanted to add was I think that when we start to talk about expanding the idea of self-care and like it being caring for your community or even just like your future, your whatever that looks like, kind of this really holistic view of self-care. When those conversations happen, which is rare, I feel like there is then a tendency to demonize the self-soothing, which I also don't think we need to do. I think that maybe we can a little bit demonize the like capitalist, like pastel washed version of it and say it can be what you need it to be. If it's you sitting in nothing but your underwear eating some ice cream tonight, that's great. And if that's what you're feeling, then that's great. But also is like, I think it doesn't have to be, it very explicitly almost can't be an either or. It's not, don't do the thing that, don't buy a face mask, go online and call a senator instead. Like that's not what we're saying here. But that it's an all and like that self-soothing is important, but it's only that first step in creating systems and structures that are actually supporting communities at large. Whether that's little systems of, a nearby like queer exchange of some sort or things along those lines, or if it's, big structures, that it's an all and approach. And I think that that's important, that we're not saying don't do the things that make you feel nice or don't do the things that do help you recover, because that is absolutely essential also, and is what gets us to where we're able to take those next steps to do the things that are more on those community and structural levels.
Yes, I completely 100% agree. And if as far as you get today is self-soothing, then that's a win. Like that is a victory, because I very strongly believe that pleasure and rest and feeling good in our bodies in ways that we can as TGD folks is a revolutionary act. We'll go back to some of our quotes that we've seen today. I think that is incredible and beautiful and has really like world-changing potential. So go forth, get that ice cream, get that face mask, call a senator, donate to the local pop-up food exchange. All of these things are incredible. I think speak for myself, my hopeful thesis in this is to take a marketed, branded definition of self-care and expand it in order for everyone to have, with Deanna Zant's model, mind you, to really look at that expanded model to say like, what are the parts and pieces that I can engage with, and how. It's to increase the palette, really, and to be able to really speak in like with more precise language around like what we need when we need to like articulate our like where we are in any given moment. If I'm saying I need to engage with some self-soothing, I know more so what that means for myself now. But if I say like I have the capacity to take on some community care projects, I can still kind of have that within my circle of self-care. I know that it will come back and it will also benefit me, and might mean that I have to do less self-soothing tomorrow. Though I still might engage in some of that face mask. So thank you, Steph, um, for bringing that up, because I think that demonizing is it's a slippery slope.
And I think that as we talk more about like what does this expansive view of self-care look like, I think that one of the things that also helps me is remembering that just like everything else, what we are inundated with in like the messaging of what self-care is that marketing, is that who can we get money out of, who can we get to engage with us and to, spend money on my product that I'm selling, and is not the end all be all, and actually is like just not representative of that scope. But I think that is one of the many things that has become so, the conversation has overflown with that very specific, that very specific model of self-care as like whitewashed, pinkwashed, like recovery, or I don't even necessarily feel like it necessarily is always intended as self-soothing, but that like pampering, and this idea that that is the only thing that you can do, that is the best thing you can do, that you can build a routine around your self-care that necessitates purchases and ample amounts of free time, that just is not reasonable or possible for so many people. Remembering that that is marketing, I think helps me too, to think about like, this is just one societal expectation for what it means to engage with this, and it is an easily lucrative one. So that's one of the many reasons that it is so inundated, but that the idea of self-care should be, and necessarily is much broader than that, and engaging with what that looks like on a much broader scale creates more flexibility for more people to engage in taking care of themselves in much more expansive ways, which can only be a good thing. So that's, yeah, that's that.
So that was a big question that, again, we don't have an expansive, all-encompassing answer to, because it's going to be different for everyone. But we have, the question to pose to all of you, and that's, what can self-care be under this new expansive model? What becomes possible? Kind of what can you imagine under this model?
And I mean, like Jack said, we don't have answers. We definitely want to, engage with folks more in like meetup structures and that kind of stuff. And I think that we've kind of talked back and forth some about what that looks like for us. but it's so necessarily individual. It's so necessarily like much more expansive than either of us could even attempt to list out and name. That I think it's a necessary place for us to engage at large and also ongoing. Because I think that also shifts and changes as the world shifts and changes around us.
Yeah, so reach out to us. I think that you have our contact information on the website portal. And like I said, we're going to be hosting the self-care strategies share out. Of course, I had to name it a tongue twister. Would love to have you join us for that live meetup. And thank you again, Steph, for partnering with me on this conversation. It was a blast as always. And I hope that this was interesting and provided a helpful framework for you all.
Yeah, and we look forward to engaging with y'all in other settings.
Thanks. Bye.